for folks to come in through the waiting room. So we've got a nice group here. Awesome. Okay, I think we've got a good amount of people in here, so I'll start talking. Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Albanese. I'm a Regional Associate Director for Admissions for the University of Rochester. And basically being a Regional Associate Director means that I am based out here. So I live in California. I travel to your school district. I work with your schools. In fact, I was telling Ms. Wise that we had a little over 30 applications from your schools this year. So really excited that you're here with me tonight. This is my 13th year in admissions, and I've worked for a somewhat less selective school, and now at the University of Rochester, I work for a selective institution. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about selectivity. We're going to talk about how college decisions are made, and we're going to get into
Let's see
all
if
of
the
those
other
things.
meetings are
If
also
you
starting
have
now.
questions at any point throughout the presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat. I might not get to them right in the moment that I'm talking, but I'll try to leave some time at the end for those too. I represent an organization called the Regional Admission Counselors of California, or RAC. RAC is a group of admissions counselors like me who live in California, but represent universities outside of California. So if you meet a person like me in RAC, you know that our institutions have prioritized having a representative in your area. We know your schools, we work with your students and your counselors so that we understand the difference between a high school that maybe offers 15 APs and a high school that offers 2 APs and everything in between. We know your schools, we know your students. We're based out here to work with your kids. Many of us have scholarships for out-of-state students, and colleges within RAC are sometimes the same, if not more affordable than some of your in-state options, depending on where you're looking and how things shake out. So believe it or not, that's one myth I like to bust, that out-of-state college is often more expensive, not always, but we can talk about that more too if you have questions. So today we're going to talk about understanding these colleges and universities. What does selectivity mean? How do we review applications? What are some of our priorities? What is this whole holistic review thing? And then try to give you some tips to strengthen your own application and kind of come up with a game plan for when you're applying to colleges. So selectivity. Basically, you can kind of break it down into 3 categories. You have the open enrollment schools, selective schools, and highly selective colleges and universities. So selectivity just refers to the portion of students who are admitted out of all the students that apply that year. Open enrollment colleges tend to admit almost all, if not all, of the students who apply. So think your community colleges, sometimes some of those like junior colleges they used to be called, schools like that. And their mission is really access. It's the ability for people with all different kinds of academic backgrounds to be able to get an education, right? Then there are selective colleges. Usually a selective college means that they can't admit more than half of the students who apply. And so that means at a selective college that we are going to be receiving applications from students who often are very smart. Many, if not most of the students might be, around our averages or higher than our averages. A lot of students that might even be a straight A student, but there just aren't enough spots to take all of those students. And so we have to make choices. And that's really where a holistic review comes in. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then highly selective colleges, these are schools that tend to admit, I would say, under 20% of the students that apply. So if you look at like the Ivy League schools, the Harvards, the Browns, the Yales, those kinds of schools, they're admitting under 10%, sometimes even under 5% of the students that apply or who apply. And so the more selective the institution, the more unpredictable it becomes if you're going to be admitted, because like I said, there might be thousands and thousands of students who apply, who have close to a 4.0 or a 4.0 unweighted GPA, never had a B in their life, or at least in high school. But that college just doesn't have spots for all of those schools, and so they have to make choices. This, I think, really underscores a point that I want to make to all the students and families listening, that because it's unpredictable, if you're applying to highly selective colleges or even selective colleges, right? You want to make sure that you have a well-balanced college list. You want to have a range of schools so that some schools might be schools that are aspirational to you, that are very selective. It's unpredictable if you're going to be admitted, even if you're a really strong student. Maybe you are around or the averages are even a little bit above your academic profile. It's a bit of a reach school. Then you want to have a good amount of schools on your list where the acceptance rates are maybe not as high. So maybe, closer to that 40 to 70% range of admission. You're around the averages or even better than the averages, so that it's more predictable that you'll likely be enrolled to at least some of those schools. And then maybe even a couple options where it's very likely the acceptance rate is high, and they have room to admit the majority of students who apply. And you are, above the averages or around the averages for those schools too. You should like all of these schools because there are thousands of colleges around the US. And just because a school is selective does not mean that it's necessarily better than one school or another. There are thousands of colleges and universities offering four-year degrees. And it's really about what is the best fit for you. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can kind of figure that out and determine that. So you want to have a well-balanced list, and you want to make sure that you like all of the colleges on that list, that you can see yourself thriving there and being your best self. And if you do that, if you have a well-balanced list, you will get in. You'll have acceptance letters, and you'll have some choices to make. And one thing that I also want to add about this is that I think a lot of people assume in the US that most colleges are selective or even highly selective, especially in a school district like yours. I know it's really competitive, right? There's a lot of pressure to take a lot of advanced placement courses. There's a lot of students getting into pretty selective colleges. And I think, there's a bit of that pressure cooker kind of environment. And so I think the assumption sometimes is that, so many of the colleges are highly selective. But did you know that right now the average acceptance rate in the US, so across all the thousands of colleges, is about 66%. So, about 2/3 of students are admitted at the typical college and university around the US. And so again, it's really just several hundred schools that are so selected that it becomes unpredictable. And again, not bad to have some on your list, but you want to make sure that you have, again, that balanced list. So let's talk now about the types of application review that you might see. So we talked about, that spectrum of the, open enrollment colleges all the way to the highly selective colleges. So the open enrollment schools, the colleges that are not as selective, because again, their mission is access and the ability for anyone from different backgrounds, academic backgrounds, to be able to get an education there. So their type of review is often formulaic, where, as long as you're, on track to graduate from high school, generally you'll be admitted. There probably is not an essay. They're not necessarily looking at your activities list or recommendation letters or that kind of thing. It's really just about, do you meet the basic admission criteria? At a community college, it's essentially just graduating from high school, right? And at some other colleges that are maybe their mission is more access driven, they might not admit all students, but they might not have as many criteria. Then when you get into selective admissions, it's almost always a holistic review. I say almost always because there are still institutions that have low acceptance rates. Think about maybe like your San Diego States or some of those like in-state options you have that are kind of those really in-demand colleges that still, don't necessarily prioritize having a super holistic review. But generally, around the country, selective institutions are going to have a very holistic review. And so in a holistic review, who's reading your file? This is typically an admissions representative, but there also might be outside readers who are hired for a season and they help read applications. Because oftentimes there are a lot of applications, and in a holistic review, there's usually not just one person reading your application. So there's usually multiple pairs of eyes. At the University of Rochester, for example, we have at least 3 or 4 people reading every single application that have their eyes on every application. So I live in California. I work with our Western students, so I will do a pretty comprehensive first review. Then we have another person on staff who does a second review. It's a little bit faster. They're thinking more about our priorities. And then we might also have some of our deans or directors or folks like that, people in financial aid, that are looking at certain, special scholarships or programs or things like that. But this is going to vary from college to college. They might read by region, they might read by school. Some colleges admit by major and admit by program, school, or department, in which case the people reading your application are going to be really adept at that specific major, that specific program. So think about majors like computer science or nursing. Colleges that admit by major and are direct admit for these kinds of programs often have admissions counselors where that might be the only thing they do all day is just read applications from students that have that specific interest. At places like Rochester, we have more of a liberal arts approach, meaning that we don't admit by major. So we have over 80 programs. But the nice thing for me is that I get to read all of the applications from my area, regardless of what school or major or whatever they're applying for. Because when our students are admitted, they're admitted to everything. They're admitted to all of our schools. They can choose what they want to major in by the end of sophomore year. So they're not kind of locked into one program or another. But there's lots of different options out there, and your counselors can help you kind of to understand some of those aspects as well. So we talked about multiple readers per file. And then, there's no standard in the US in terms of application deadlines. So there are different types of deadlines, but in general, you've got rolling admissions. And typically colleges that are more open enrollment or maybe less selective will have more of a rolling approach where you can apply throughout a certain window or maybe throughout the entire year. And you'll usually hear back within a couple of weeks in that kind of admissions process. Then there's also some programs like early action where you there are deadlines and you try to apply by that early deadline, let's say. So you'll get your decision early, but you still have all the way until May 1 to make up your mind. And you might not hear back. You'll hear back earlier than other students in regular decision, but maybe not as quickly as like rolling admission or that kind of thing. And then selective and highly selective colleges tend to have early decision options. And sometimes early decision is the only way to apply. So they often are not rolling admission. They have specific deadlines. And there's not even an early action option. There's just an early decision or regular decision option. And that's what we do at the University of Rochester. So you can apply November 1 for early decision. You will find out if you're admitted earlier than students that apply regular decision. But if you are admitted, you're committing to go. You're committing to come to the university. And that's because early decision is binding. So it's a contract that you sign between your family, your counselor, and the university where you're applying that says, if I get in, I'm going to go. And you usually only have a couple of weeks to make that commitment. And it's a binding agreement. So really the only way to break the agreement is if the school is not meeting your financial needs. But an important thing to keep in mind is that many colleges that offer early decision usually can meet 100% of your family's demonstrated need. which basically just means that if you have need, if you can't afford to be a full pay student to university, that college is going to meet whatever need your family has, as determined by usually the free application for federal student aid, FAFSA, and oftentimes something called the CSS profile through the College Board. And you only apply to one early decision school if you choose an early decision school. So that's why, you apply to one place, and if you get in, you go there. Then regular decision has a deadline, unlike rolling admission. And usually that's sometime, in the early, like late winter, early spring, usually with at least a few months to still make up your mind. May 1 is typically the nationally recognized enrollment deadline. So for those students who are not early decision, yes, so then you have basically until May 1 to make up your mind. This year, because of delays with the free application for federal student aid or the FAFSA, certain colleges, including some of your in-state options in California, have moved back that May 1 deadline. But that's probably just going to be for this season because there were some delays with the FAFSA. So by the time that, I think most of you are juniors, younger, right? So by the time that you, get to your timeline in senior year, typically May 1 is going to be the date in which you need to deposit and decide to go to that college. So in holistic review, there's a lot of different priorities that come into play. The university is thinking about its budget. And this goes for both public colleges and private colleges. Public colleges do receive support from the state, but that support nationwide has been dwindling over the years. And so a lot of public colleges, they tend to try to admit some out-of-state students. You can pay that out-of-state tuition. That's going to help with their budgetary goals, so that they can offer the amazing services and programs that students want. I think sometimes families assume that colleges are in this for the money, or they are maybe spending money on things that aren't necessary, like fancy rock walls and lazy rivers. But if you look at the typical expenditures for universities, and all this data, it's available, it's out there, it's collected by different governmental organizations. But in general, universities are responsible with their budgets. They are transparent with how they allocate the money. It usually, first and foremost, goes to the students. Then it might go to resources like the teaching staff, the faculty, then to the buildings and the operations, that kind of thing. But universities have a budget, whether they're public or private. Then there's the strategic plan, the goals of the university. I would say the mission of the university. And so if you look at a public college, they typically have a mandate from that state that a certain portion of the students need to be from that state, right? Because they're a public university. Their mission, their goal is to serve the students, the public, right? But of that state, of that area. Whereas private colleges don't have that same kind of mission or goal necessarily. At a private college, we typically want to have representation from around the country and world, and have a balance of different states and backgrounds and all different kinds of things there. There also might be areas in which the university wants to grow. So maybe the university is building a new engineering school, and they'd love to see more interest in engineering that year. Maybe the university just made investments in their music performance spaces, and maybe that isn't as popular, but they'd love to have more musicians that year. So these kinds of priorities can come into play with the admissions process. Of course, academic colleges, programs, and majors are always a priority. We want a balance of those things on our campus. Every university is going to have certain departments and programs that may be a little more popular than others, a little bit more, be a bit more in demand. This very well in California with how you have these impacted programs and things like that. And by the way, that is very much a California thing. Before I moved to California, impaction was just a root canal, right? It was a dental problem. I didn't know what that meant in terms of college admissions. And so that's a great reason to look out of state because that is very rarely a problem outside of California. With there being, too many students admitted with its interest in a particular program or major that it impacts your ability to graduate on time. But that of course is a priority for the institution to have that balance and representation of different programs and majors. And then of course, with a holistic review, we want students that bring different skills to the table. We don't want all of our students to think the same way, to look the same way, to have the same beliefs and those kinds of things. In general, right? Now, there might be certain colleges that do have those goals. And again, that's why it's important to look at the mission statement of the college. For example, maybe you are an artist and you're looking at an art school. Well, their mission, their goal might be to educate artists. So they're going to want a lot of art majors, right? But they might not really have a need or ability to educate a computer science major. If you have a certain religious preference or background, there might be institutions that part of their mission or their goal is to enroll students with that same religion or background or that kind of thing. So there are colleges that, do want specific things. But in general, especially selective colleges, we want a big diverse balance and mix of all of these things, different religions, different ways of thinking about the world, different socioeconomic statuses, right? We don't want all of our students to come from really wealthy and privileged backgrounds. We don't want all of our students to not come from this background. We want a balance, right? A mix of things so that when you come to the college, your mind can be grown and blown because this is a chance to be surrounded by people who are going to push you, who think about the world differently than you. And it's the combination of all of those differences, all of those different backgrounds and ways of thinking. When you work together, when you put all of those things together, that leads to innovation, that leads to your mind being expanded, to your knowledge grown, to your comfort zone being challenged, and to you growing up. And that's part of that college experience too. So we're not just trying to educate students, we're trying to help them grow as people at schools that do holistic reviews and that have a bit of a liberal arts kind of background to them. So we talked about the diversity of the class. And then, the institution might have their own profile, their own reputation to keep in mind as well. If they are a highly selective college, their average GPA might be, a 3.8, 3.9 unweighted. So basically very few students are, on average, are getting below Bs in many of their classes and mostly A average students. It doesn't mean that they won't take students that are below that academic profile, but they might be mindful of that, right? Where they don't want to, accept a big portion of students that year that are well below the averages, even if they really like them, even if they think that they would make a good contribution to the community, because they do have, they want to keep that in mind. They want to be able to keep consistency of the class, that professors are used to teaching, students with a certain academic background and ability of skills and what they know and their knowledge coming in. And that would be a bit of a shock to the system, right? If all of a sudden that changed that next year. So there's so many different priorities that colleges are keeping in mind. There's a lot of different things that are on enrollment managers' minds. And when you apply in a holistic review, we are asking you a lot of different questions. We're gathering a lot of different information to try to get at some of those priorities and get at that balanced class and get to know you in the context of your environment. So we're going to look at your GPA. Oftentimes, we recalculate at selective colleges. So a lot of students might come up to me and say, oh, I'm a 4.3 GPA. Well, at the University of Rochester, we recalculate your GPA. You can't go above a 4.0. You do an unweighted GPA. So no one has a 4.3. And so I think sometimes high schoolers are surprised about that, but there's no standard in the US for how colleges should look at a GPA. And so certain state systems might do a certain way. Private colleges will do things their own way. At selective colleges, they're usually recalculating. They're usually putting people on a 4.0 scale to level that playing field so that whether you're applying from a public school in Ohio or a private school in Arizona, that, we have students kind of applying on the same scale. So the GPA at a selective college is oftentimes separated from the rigor. So the way that we determine if a student is taking on a challenging, rigorous course load in their high school is not, again, in selective college, it's usually not by looking at a weighted GPA and saying, oh, they're 4.5, so they must take a lot of honors and APs. Instead, we look at your transcript, we look at the number of honors of APs or whatever advanced coursework is available. We have something called a school profile that comes from your high school, and it will tell us that your school offers this many advanced classes, and there's these kinds of limitations on taking those advanced classes. And we'll use our judgment to say, okay, this student is taking the most rigorous possible coursework. They're taking somewhat demanding coursework, they're taking not so demanding coursework, and we kind of can assess it that way and use our judgment and our knowledge of your schools. Test scores. So in California, with your in-state options, they are test-free or test-blind, meaning that they won't even accept test scores when they're evaluating you for admission. The majority of colleges in the US now are test optional, but there are some colleges and universities that do require scores. And so, that is definitely something to consider. Do I want to submit test scores? Do I want to study and take the SAT, the ACT, that kind of thing? Or do I not value that? And I want to find colleges that also don't value that as well. So that's a personal decision, but something to definitely chat with your family and your counselor about. Awards and achievements, we'll look at those things, your activities, the essay. A lot of you have probably heard that we look at the essay, right? So if you're looking at common application colleges, there are, I think over 600 colleges in the US that use the common application. They have 6 different essays you can choose from, with one being a topic of your own choice. Or you might, be applying to the UCs, and they're going to have their own types of writing requirements. But essays usually come into play with selective admissions, letters of recommendation, and finally this thing called demonstrated interest, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But these are just some examples of factors that we're looking at in holistic review. And what portion of which of these factors is more important than the other? Usually it's not like one thing really outweighs everything else. With the exception of the academics, because, in selective admissions, academics gets your foot in the door. Oftentimes, like I said, the majority of students applying at selective colleges are very strong students. So, it's kind of like everyone around you applying is around an A average student and takes a lot of APs and all of those things. So those academics get your foot in the door. But then beyond that, what did you do with all of the rest of your time in high school to make an impact, and to, and what else will make your application stand out? That's where all these other things really come into play. But it's not like one thing is more important than the other. It's really just how they all combine, and how it all comes into play with the context of your application. So, we're looking at, again, all these things you mentioned before. We talked about some of this, but, we're also looking at things like your portfolio. If you're maybe applying as an art major, we might offer interviews at selective colleges. We'll have those interview notes. If you are maybe first in your family to go to a four-year college, maybe you're first generation, that like part of your personal information. So we'll have all of these things to keep in mind when we're reading your application. We'll have all this context in mind. And so, here's some examples of those things. So personal information, we have demographics. So we might know about your gender identity, your age, your military status, your citizenship. What we won't know because of recent Supreme Court decisions is your race or ethnicity, at least at the point that you're applying to the college or the university. So that won't be recorded, but we'll have lots of other information on your background. Your family's information. So are you the first in your family to go to a four-year college? Are you first generation? Or do you come from a long line of family that has advanced degrees? what language you speak, what your heritage language is, or do you have other languages that you speak? How you identify with religion. So these are all things that may be asked, and that you can optionally, share this information if you'd like us to know these things about you when you're applying and have some of this context in mind. Your academic information. So we'll know where you go to high school. We'll know what's available at your high school. So we will know if your school offers advanced courses like maybe college credit in the high school, dual enrollment, honors courses, advanced placement, the International Baccalaureate program, and things like that. We'll look at the trend in your grades. So, do you kind of start out here in freshman year, and then maybe in sophomore year, the rigor gets a little harder and the grades go down a bit, but then you kind of course correct by junior year and it goes back up. We're going to look at those kinds of trends. We're going to look at, again, the unweighted versus the weighted GPA. Oftentimes we recalculate, but just keep in mind that the unweighted GPA is usually the more noticed thing in selective admissions, because it's a more fair playing field with other students, but then we separate out that rigor. Class rank, this is really going away. A lot of schools don't provide us with rank anymore. Sometimes they'll give us a table to give us a rough idea of where you fall in the class, but giving us an exact rank, that's kind of going away with a lot of schools, but we might know that information as well. And your intended major, if you know what that is. Maybe you're undecided, and there's plenty of colleges where it's fine to apply and decided, it's fine to be undecided as well. We talked about test scores. I'm not going to go too much more into this. Just keep in mind that the policies for test optional schools will vary, or test free schools. You might still need to submit scores for all or certain scholarships or for academic placement. So those are just good questions to ask your admissions counselor at that university. Extracurriculars. So on the common application, you can report up to 10 extracurricular activities. And this is really anything you do in your free time, anything that you do outside of learning in school. So I think a lot of students assume that these have to be school-sponsored clubs or sports. And they certainly can be, but you can also, and you should also, talk about things like a part-time job. If you have family responsibilities, maybe you have a single parent and they work and you have to take care of your younger siblings. If you have internships, if you do things outside of school, that's totally fine. Anything that fills your time that's meaningful to you, that teaches you things about the world or who you are, that's important, right? And so, feel free to include those things. And we want to know about your interests, what skills you're developing. We want to see how involved you are. Are you involved in things for just 1 year, for multiple years? Are you taking on leadership roles in those activities? What kinds of impact were you able to make with those activities? Were you just a member of a club, or did you do other things with that membership or that leadership? So those are some things that we'll kind of think about when we look at the activities list. I think sometimes students assume, or families assume, that we only want the well-rounded students, right? We want a really wide variety of activities. That's not the case. We just want you to be involved with whatever it is that makes you happy, that feeds your soul. And we want you to be involved in activities that are meaningful to you and where you grow your skills and your opportunities to take on leadership roles. So whether that's in a variety of activities or just maybe 1 or 2 kinds of activities, as long as you're getting the most out of all of these things, that's really what's more important than whether or not you're super well-rounded or not. Honors and awards. So you can talk about these things with selected colleges, especially if you're applying through the common application. So don't overlook these things. Feel free to mention whatever you'd like, but I think especially if you've won maybe like a regional award, or especially like a national or international award or recognition, definitely put those things down. But this could be anything from being on the dean's list in your school to a more kind of competitive award regionally or nationally. So really anything goes here. But if it's an acronym, make sure that you spell out what that is, because we don't always know what these regional associations are, or those kinds of things. So just make sure that you put the full name down there. Then the writing. So with the Common Application, there is the personal statement. So this is like the Common App essay. As you mentioned before, there's 6 options, and you can Google them. So here's a tip: just go on Google, type in Common Application essay prompts, and you can take a look at what those are right now. The 6th one is a topic of your own choice. But my tip to you is, after thinking about those essays, try to find something. Try to find a story you can tell, or a topic that you want to write about within those first 5 topics. Because I think sometimes when your creativity is a bit constrained, or the topic is focused and constrained, your creativity can really come through. But I think sometimes students, do they just kind of skim through the first 5 essays and they pick that topic of your own choice? And sometimes students forget to have a topic, and the essay can get kind of a little bit all over the place, and it's maybe not serving your application as well. So take your time with the essay. This is really a part of the application that you as a student can influence. This fully comes from you. You choose your topic, you choose what you write about. So you can't change your past grades, right? You can't alter what the recommenders say about you, but you can take your time with that essay. So really, really focus on that and give yourself a lot of time to write it. And the great time to do that is that the summer going into senior year, because you have all summer to write about it and think about it. Then selected colleges will also often ask you to write something else, a supplemental question, or even multiple questions. These are usually not as long as the Common App essay, and these are trying to get at really specific questions that the university wants to know, maybe about your character, the kind of person you are, or maybe your specific major or department, or that kind of thing. So really take your time with those supplemental questions. I would say they're almost more important than the Common App essay for colleges that ask them. So take your time there, get specific. My tip there is to go on Google and look up the school, read the mission statement, look up the departments, try to have some specifics in that essay, help the admission counselor picture you on campus when you read those essays, because that's why they're there. That's why we're asking about them. And then this will vary from college to college, but I would say a lot of selected colleges, they're really tracking everything. They have the ability to track everything, every email that you have, everything you sign up for, and they can see it. And whether or not they use that information to make an admissions decision is going to vary from college to college, but we can often see these things. So when I read an application, I don't just have the Common Application. I have all the emails I have with the student. I have the interview notes. I have all that context when I'm reading an application. So tip there, reach out to your admissions counselor, find out who they are, try to reach out to them. If you're applying to that college, it's a really good idea to try to find out who your admissions counselor is and make a connection with them. The essays, we kind of went into this, so I'm not going to go too much more into that, but I'm sure we'll have whole topics on that in the future. And there's lots of great resources out there. Letters of recommendation. My tip here is, if your college is asking for a teacher recommendation letter, make sure that you give them plenty of time. You don't want to just overwhelm the teachers and ask them like a couple days before it's due. You want to give them a lot of time, and I'm sure that your college counselors will probably have a process for this and give you instructions on how to request those letters. Sometimes students prepare like a brag sheet for the teacher, so you can kind of remind them about highlights or things there. Your teacher does not have to be someone that gave you an A. In fact, if you had to work really hard to get a B in a class, maybe that's a better teacher to choose, because they can talk about how hard you work. They can talk about how you went to all the extra study sessions, how you fought for that B, right? The kind of student you were. Whereas if you just kind of breeze through the class, the teacher might not have as many things to say. So think about who's going to be able to talk about the kind of student that I am, kind of person I'm going to be in the classroom in college, the way that I like to learn, the impact I have on the room around me. Am I hopefully not disruptive in class, right? Hopefully helping the peers around me, working well in groups, all those things. So pick a teacher that can talk about those things. Your counselor, maybe they'll be asked to write a letter. On the admission side, especially at selective colleges, we understand that in California, your schools are really large. I think that student to counselor ratio is sort of like 1,000 to 1 in certain schools in California. So we understand if your counselor maybe just didn't have a chance to get to know you super well. And it's okay with us if your counselor just checks the box and says, sorry, I don't know the student well enough to write a letter. But my tip to you as a student is if your counselor doesn't know your first name, like if you're walking down the hallway and your counselor maybe wouldn't know your name, make sure they know your name, right? Try to make that connection with them so that they will have something to say. Sometimes it's the students who do really well or are kind of struggling in school that get the most attention from the counselors. But if you're kind of in the middle there, you want to make sure you get to know your counselor, especially now. This is an earlier time to do it, right? So you have that time. But we really value those letters of recommendation in selective colleges. Okay, so demonstrated interest. This is a really hot button topic. Some colleges might take this into account. Some colleges might not. It might not be part of the admissions process. But I would say if you're applying to a college, it's a good idea to sign up for things formally, get to know who your admissions counselor is, try to make a contact with them. Because even if the school does not take those things into account, it will just benefit you, right? To learn more about that university and to feel really good about making your decision. But for colleges that do take this into account, it might give your application a little bit of a boost, especially if you're kind of on the border of being admitted, because these give your counselor more things to fight for. So if a student is applying to Rochester, maybe they're a little bit below our averages, but I met them in their high school when I had my high school visit. They did an interview with me. They've been emailing me back and forth, asking questions. They're taking their application seriously. They're showing how much they are genuinely being thoughtful about why they're applying to Rochester. I'm going to fight for that student, right? And we have committee and we get to kind of fight for our kids. So I'm going to fight for the kids that I've met, right? If I don't know you, I might not have as much to kind of go on when I'm in that committee. So I think this is important, whether or not the college takes it into account, that you do want to, sign up for things, be thoughtful about why you're applying, take those supplemental essays seriously, especially for the schools on your list, right? The schools that you're applying to. Because I know you're going to get a ton of emails from colleges. You're probably already starting to get them. Does this mean you have to open every email, sign up for every single form? No, especially not at this early stage. But once you have your list of colleges, that's when you want to make sure you're reading all the emails, you're checking everything, you're signing up for things, you're giving information. So the decisions that you'll typically see are, okay, you're admitted, and you have until, if you're applying early decision, you have usually a couple of weeks to commit to pay that deposit to enroll. Or if you're applying under a different plan, like early action, regular decision, that kind of thing, you have until May 1 to make up your mind. Conditional offers. So this might say, well, you're admitted if you do something. So for example, we have a program called Early College Opportunities at Rochester. And so we might ask you to get a little extra support from us over the summertime in order to have you come in. You might be deferred, so you might apply early, but they might say, you know what, we want to see your senior grades, so we're not going to deny you, we're just going to defer your application, we're going to wait until we see senior grades. You might be waitlisted, and every college handles that a little differently, or you might be denied. So those are kind of the typical decisions that you'll see. So your game plan, know what your transcript looks like to a college rep. Take a look at it, kind of remove yourself from what that weighted GPA is, look at the trend in your grades, look at what you think we're going to see on our end, what we might be looking and thinking about your application, and be ready to talk about those things. So use the additional information section in the application. If you have a couple of C's on your application, be ready to talk about why and what you did to improve in those subject areas. You can talk about that in additional info or ask your counselor to talk about that for you. Know your strengths and weaknesses, know where you want to grow and why that college might be able to help you with that. Understand what colleges might work best for you. Visit campuses, interview, engage, and build a college list that you're really happy and proud of. We talked about the building that balanced list. and thinking about if you want to apply for test optional colleges or not and how that looks. So I'm not going to go too much more into that. But I know we're almost at time, so feel free to turn your cameras on. If you have any questions, I am here. And if you would like more information specifically from Rochester, so if you want to get my email, contact me, be on our list, you can scan this QR code right here and sign up. But we'll let you know when we're coming to your school because we get a bunch of applications from your area and I'd love to talk to you more. But let me know if you have any questions. So I'm looking in the chat and I see we have at least one question here so far. For a student who's very advanced in a certain field that they want to major in, should they be taking junior level college classes? Does this have a place in the college application process? Are there certain types of schools who may look at this more? So yeah, I think the question is, kind of how do you take on advanced coursework? How do you show that rigor? I would say, first and foremost, I think doing what's going to make sense for your student. So, if your student is ready for those courses, for sure, it's good to take on the challenge. It's good to take on the rigor. But if your student is kind of struggling a little bit to get A's in college prep classes, then I would say you want to have a conversation with the counselor about, does that make sense? Is it better to get some low B's in some AP courses or to get A's in college prep classes? And I think it's going to kind of vary on where you're applying, but you want to kind of make sure that you're setting your student up for success first and foremost, that they're not going to struggle too much. You want them to be challenged, right? You want them to be rigorous, but not that they're going to, go below high B's in those courses for selective colleges. Then I would say, if you're looking at dual enrollment or community college classes versus APs or that kind of thing, APs are more of a standardized kind of curriculum. And so certain selective colleges, mine, for example, we value that standardization because we know what we're getting, right? We know what the product is. If someone is taking AP Calc BC, like I know what goes into that exam and that test and doing well in that course. It's standardized versus a community college class. It might be very rigorous, but the point is, because there's not standardization, I don't know that for sure. So, at Rochester, if the course is taught in the high school at a college level, if it's like a college in the high school kind of class, we actually don't accept those credits, but we would take AP credits for that kind of thing, potentially if the student has a high score in the exam. So just something to think about there, but it's a good question to ask. And then, I would say, will you get credits transferred, that kind of thing? That really varies college to college, but usually selective colleges want you to have a full 4-year experience. And so you're oftentimes not able to transfer a full associate's degree worth of credits. Sometimes students are in these programs where they can get a full associate's degree before they graduate. Usually that's not going to be the case for like highly selective colleges. Okay, well, I think I'm getting that we're at time from our counselor, but please feel free to send me an email. I'm always happy to talk more, or like I said, if you scan this QR code, you'll be on our mailing list, you'll get all my information, and we can talk more about this in the future. But I think we've got to leave it here now so that Ms. Wise can get on to the next session. But thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to me tonight. I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. Like I said, I'm always happy to talk more, either about this topic or about my university. Either way, we want to make sure that you feel well informed as you build your college lists. So thank you guys so much. Really appreciate it. I hope you have a great rest of your night, and take care.
Thank you. Just a reminder that this is being recorded and it will be posted on the College and Career website within the next week or so. But thank you all for attending and have a great evening.